Yeah, so pretty much, man. I listened to your podcast like a couple months ago when you released it on Turkesterone, and yeah, in the intervening time, got about 1 million messages about it. So I was like, okay, let me actually like dig into this and see if there's anything there. So we can keep it relatively short. So like my basic thing was initially, okay, we've got two studies on, well, we've got some studies from like the 70s and the 80s out of Russia that are done either like in vitro or on animals or whatever, non-human animals. And then there were these two studies. One was 2006. That was out of, I think Bill Campbell was an author on that one. And then there's one 2019, which is the one that everyone shares. And I was kind of going through those and I was like, okay, well, the 2006 one found absolutely nothing. And so then people, I guess, were just like, okay, there's no point in researching this. But then in 2019, this other group was like, okay, let's try this again. And then they did find a pretty significant effect in terms of like LBM and 1 rep max. And I was like, okay, well, let me, because at first I actually didn't realize that there was that 2019 study. I only had the 2006 study. So I was like, okay, this is just full on placebo. But then when I saw the 2019 study, I was more like, okay, well, we got one study showing nothing. We got one study, showing an effect. That's still not much. Like, proceed with caution. But then I dug into the 2019 study more, and I was like, wait a minute. Like, first of all, they used bioelectrical impedance. Second of all, they use this like non-third party tested supplement. And so it's like, okay, is this even a study worth talking about? And then I realized, wait a minute, beta-ecdysterone is not necessarily the same thing as turkesterone, I don't think. So it's like they weren't even on turkesterone. They're just like structurally similar, which is like you can't just make that jump and be like, just because this thing might have had an effect, which was most likely a false positive in one study, doesn't necessarily mean that like turkesterone itself would have that same effect. So that's kind of where I'm at. I just wanted to like touch base with you to make sure that I'm on the right track with that, and if there was like anything that I missed. So let me just go to my questions list here, and I'll have you just like speak on this a little bit. So okay, so yeah, the first question is like, did those studies actually look at turkesterone?
Right. So those studies did not look at turkesterone specifically. So they looked at um, other compounds that would be within the class of compounds called ecdysteroids. So when you look at like uh, beta ecdysterone and you look at turkesterone, these are both ecdysteroids. They have structural similarities, and usually when compounds have structural similarities, they have at least some overlap in terms of functional similarities, physiologically speaking. But a little change in structure can sometimes lead to a big change in function. So when you look at the human research, looking at relevant outcomes in resistance training interventions with turkesterone, to my knowledge, there's literally none. I'm not familiar of any study that I've ever seen that gives turkesterone as a supplement to human beings lifting weights and seeing how it impacts their gains over time. What I have seen is people extrapolating studies from other ecdysteroids and saying, well, turkesterone is similar in structure, it's probably similar in function. And sometimes they'll take it a step further and say, let's look at in vitro research and compare some characteristics between, for example, beta ecdysterone and turkesterone, and then say, well, based on this in vitro finding, we think turkesterone might actually theoretically be even better. So we can look at this beta ecdysteroid study, it's something that's looking at like, beta ecdysterone and say, well, I would think that turkesterone maybe is even better than that based on this in vitro finding. But, ultimately that's a bit of a risky jump to make. It could be accurate, but also it could not be accurate. And until we have human trials with turkesterone supplementation looking at relevant outcomes, it's always going to be a matter of speculation in terms of, can we compare the two? And if so, how do we use findings from one compound to make inferences about a structurally distinct compound? It's not a really solid foundation for making evidence-based claims about the compound that has not yet been tested within, ecologically valid settings. We have some turkesterone studies that are in vitro, some in animal models, but I'm not familiar with any in human beings that are lifting weights.
Right. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there aren't any. And then the issue that you run into with that is like, I think on your podcast you had said that there are something like, several hundred different types of ecdy steroids. And so if you just want to run down the line, you can always sub one in and say, oh, this one's structurally similar to beta ecdysterone, and just make that jump with hundreds of different compounds. So it's like, why pick out turkesterone as the one? And oh, if that one doesn't work, we'll shift to another one. And here you are just, running people's wallets dry over all this, like, just blanket speculation, basically.
Yeah. And my understanding is that the choice for turkesterone was not fully arbitrary in terms of singling it out for interest. I think it all comes down to basic research rather than applied research. So in vitro studies and animal studies saying, well, it looks like perhaps there are anabolic properties, and it looks like if we take the 5 most convenient ecdy steroids that we studied in this context, it looks like turkesterone did better than these 4 or these 3 or whatever the case may be. So I understand the logic driving it, but what's really fascinating is making a decision about whether or not to supplement with turkesterone today really is, it comes down to a matter of perspective, a matter of how much relevant evidence do you need to make that jump, because we can't really go and find several studies that actually are researching what we're interested in. We don't have those human trials determining if turkesterone leads to better gains in people who are lifting. So it becomes a matter of logic and theory and cost benefit analysis. And one thing to highlight is that we are not one study away. When we look at, so for example, the capsaicin literature, I am fascinated by capsaicin. I can think of at least 4, well, more than that. I can think of it more than a handful of human trials that have looked at capsaicin or other capsaicinoids like capsiate, looking at the effects of those supplements on resistance training outcomes. I can think of 4 positive studies at least in lifters, human beings, healthy people lifting weights, and I'm still not ready to recommend it because I haven't seen it replicated in enough independent labs. Now, I'm sure that there are other people who look at those 4 studies and say, there's 4 studies, like this works. So it really comes down to your personal interpretation of the literature, and how you kind of weigh that cost benefit analysis and what level of confidence you need to basically reassure you that a particular compound is going to be safe and effective and worth the price that it's set at.
Right. I was trying to draw a comparison for the video of between turkesterone and another supplement, where it's like, okay, we have a bit of scant mechanistic data and 2 kind of adjacent human trials and just tons of social media hype. Like, is there something that you would say, okay, this has basically the same evidence of support, but without the hype, and the only reason you haven't heard of it is because people haven't been marketing it to you? Can you think of an example that would be similar?
I really can't, which is what makes turkesterone such a fascinating thing. And now I'm biased in terms of my perspective on this particular question, because I will acknowledge I usually don't start even looking into a supplement until there are a few studies to really sink my teeth into, just because of the way I approach fitness and the way I approach the content that I make and the recommendations I make. I wouldn't even begin to start looking into in vitro stuff until I had some human evidence to really stack it up with. So there might be other ingredients and supplements that are out there that are following a similar trajectory, but I usually don't hear about them until there's actually some evidence available. So I don't know, but as far as I can tell, the the story of turkesterone is a unique one in the way that it has captured so much interest in the absence of applied research. And, you know, we had a podcast segment about it, and we talked about turkesterone and gave our perspectives. And I'm kind of torn on it because I don't, it's important to recognize in the interest of fairness that the absence of evidence does not indicate that something cannot work or even does not work. When we have literally no relevant evidence to use, then it's difficult to say in one direction or the other that the supplement does or does not work. So sometimes I think people will like bring up a supplement like turkesterone and say, Eric, tell me all the reasons why this cannot work. And I'm like, dude, I've got nothing for you. There is no evidence here. So it's about extrapolating mechanisms. It's about logic. It's about theory. It's frankly about intuition to some extent. And there's not much that we can really look at specifically for evidence. And, one of the things I find fascinating about this body of evidence, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but you mentioned the study by Eisenman, where they gave this product that was kind of a mixture that contained an ecdysteroid, which was not turkesterone, and also contained a little bit of leucine. And one of the interesting things there is if you read the paper closely, you'll notice that they did do independent testing of the ecdysteroid content of the capsule. And the capsule was intended to provide 100 milligrams per capsule. And in reality, it provided 6. So now they also tested for different kinds of like anabolics that might be adulterating the supplement, right? Because that's kind of the first thing you would expect is there were these positive findings. This only provided like 6% of the active ingredient based on their analysis, their independent analysis. So then you think like, what is this, just like oral anabolics that are spiked in it? But no, that was not the case. They didn't find any like oral anabolics that had adulterated the supplement, but they also just did not find with their analysis, they only found like 6% of the labeled active ingredient, which makes the findings even more fascinating because if you told me that they found those findings with 100 milligrams per capsule, I'm already like, well, that's weird because previous research did not find that. But then when you tell me it's only 6% of the labeled amount, then it becomes, once again, even more fascinating to say, well, how is a dose this low having these pronounced results when we've got a study by Wilborn showing really no effect to write home about. So the whole like beta ecdysterone literature is fascinating, and then by extension, all of that fascination gets lumped into the turkesterone conversation.
Yeah, I wonder if something has to do with just like the fact that its name sounds like testosterone, and it's like it has a very anabolic sounding name. But like, and that could be part of the reason why it's like, oh, this is like almost testosterone, but it's still natty, if that has something to do with it. But real quick, in that study, so I just want to confirm this. They found that it had 6% of the ecdysteroid compound or 6% of the leucine, or both?
The ecdysteroid compound.
Wow. Okay. Let me just double check what the actual like dosing of that was, because I think you said 100 milligrams, but for some reason in my head I was thinking it was more than that.
It was more. It was 100 milligrams per capsule, and they had 2 groups.
Oh,
One
okay.
group had
it was
2 capsules.
Yeah. Okay, so it was 100 milligrams of ecdysterone from spinach extracts plus 100 milligrams of leucine, which is so random. Like,
yeah,
that just seems like a marketing ploy to me. Like, I'm not surprised that it was underdosed, because like they can now put on the bottle plus extra leucine, and it's like, bro, that is barely a dusting of leucine. Like 100 milligrams is nowhere close to being enough to be anabolic.
Right. And yeah, I mean, and that's one of the reasons I always say, like, based on their independent testing, they found 6% is, I mean, if you want to do a beta ecdysterone assay, you don't just like pull it off the shelf, right? So like
Yeah.
there is also the potential that that it was a bad assay. I mean, that's not a claim I'm making, but you have to be open to all possibilities, right? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of a unique analyte where the assays, like I would imagine the people who ran the assays for the beta ecdysteroid content or the beta ecdysterone content, it's probably the first time they had ever assayed for it. Like I'd have to guess, or if they'd done it before, probably not many times.
So
So it's complicated for sure.
so why didn't they test the supplement before doing the trial? Like that seems like a weird thing to do after the fact. And why wasn't the paper retracted if they didn't even have sufficient active ingredient in it, you know?
Well, I would assume that the things were happening simultaneously. Like we're going to run this intervention. I don't. Do you remember if it was funded by the company that provided?
It said no conflicts of interest, but it was funded by the anti-doping,
Hmm,
some WADA affiliate or something like that. Yeah, financial support from WADA.
okay. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
what I would anticipate is they decided we are interested in an applied intervention on this, and while we are doing that, we would also like to, verify the label claims, because that's honestly a step that most supplement studies don't take, is to do independent verification of label claim. And so it was impressive that they did that, and in this case, very informative that they did it. And of course, it also makes you wonder, what if all studies did that? How would that change our perception of some of these multi-ingredient formulas that we have research on? Like maybe they are not actually what we thought they were. But anyway, I would bet that they probably teamed up with some colleagues who do more of this advanced chemical analysis and said, here's some samples. We're going to run our study. We'll link up with you whenever you have the findings. And so they probably ran their study while it was being tested, and said, well, we're going to do the study anyway. And it's an applied study. We're going to say what we found. And the reason it's not retracted is because I would say usually with retraction, you would find a retracted study because there was an error made that cannot really be undone, like something that fundamentally like really spoils the findings. Or, in some cases, you'll see retractions that are due to procedural issues, fraudulent activity, all sorts of different stuff that could go on. Insufficient ethical clearance to have run the study. So that's kind of a procedural issue that's like, yeah, you're going to get that retracted. In this case, I don't think it rises to the level of retraction, because it's interesting. Like it's not that they did something incorrectly or wrong. It's just that this supplement didn't have as much as we thought, but it still had some. And so now we can say, here's the dose that is associated with this response in this study with these methods. And then we can drive ourselves crazy trying to figure out why that was the case. So it's a very fascinating study in that way.
So this study was placebo controlled, right? So like why, if there was only 6% of the active ingredient, why did they find a significant effect in lean body mass? Is it just a false positive?
It very well could be. I don't recall off the top of my head number of participants per group. Do you happen to know?
It was like a 20 or 21, I think. Yeah, I think, or there was 46 subjects in total, I believe.
Split among
46 in total. So let's just say, I don't know, 15-ish per group, something like that.
So the false positives, we talk about them as if they are anomalies, but they're more of an expectation than an anomaly, right? So like one of the things that I always find it a bit humorous that people act like we've got this p-value of 0.05, this kind of 5% threshold that protects us against false positives. And it's like, well, and I'm not, this is not a textbook definition of the p-value by any means, but you'll see studies where they say, oh, we have these robust protections based on probabilities with whatever statistical model they're using. But it's not that rare to get a false positive, right? So like a p-value would tell us that if the null hypothesis is true, we would only expect to see data, this extreme or more extreme in 5% of cases, and or whatever the p-value happens to be. So let's say the p-value is like 0.049, right? A 5% chance or a 4.5% chance of something happening is not rare. It's not implausible, and it is truly an expectation. Something that happens 4% of the time will occur,
Right.
especially when you consider the sheer scope of research that's going on. Then you consider small sample sizes and the fact that there is sampling error. You get groups of 12, 15, 20 people. They don't always have the same characteristics, even though you would hope that they would with random assignment to groups. And so when you look at small studies, then you see instances where, it's not uncommon to see an exercise science study where you've got 8, 10 people per group. What if there's 4 people with just insane genetics in one of those groups in one way or the other? They could have great genetics, they could have terrible genetics in terms of their response to training. We can see placebo groups that have very unusual findings. We can see treatment groups with completely useless treatments that have unbelievable findings. And, that is the nature of probability. It's not just that it can happen, it's that it will happen. And so, there are cases where even when you do everything you can, placebo-controlled trial, random allocation to the different groups, there are instances where, we're going to see false positives. And so it's possible that that's what's going on in this study by Eisenman. But one of the challenging things about false positives is it's hard to know until you have more replication attempts and you say, oh, okay, this one was a bit of an outlier. And it could be just sampling error. It could just be, that's the way that the coin flips sometimes. Sometimes you flip a coin and you get 6 heads in a row. You won't do that every time you do a series of 6 flips, but it will happen eventually. So that's why we like to see so many studies and so many replications from so many independent groups. Is only when you have all that data can you sort through it and figure out which findings were atypical and which findings were more typical.
Right. What would you say to someone who's like, okay, I've seen the Reddit threads, and I've seen the YouTubers talking about this and the good testimonials on the websites. Like, I want to get out ahead of the science. You know what I mean? Like, I'm gonna jump ahead of the curve here and try this out for myself. Like, I'll take a gamble with the money. Like, is that fine? How do you feel about someone who would feel that way about something like turkesterone?
Yeah, I view it as neither fine or not fine. I view it really as a matter of perspective. Now, first and foremost, I think you at least want to have certainty that a particular ingredient is safe within the dosages that are being given. So if someone is saying like, I'm going to get out ahead of this and I have no idea if it's safe and I'm going to tell 1 million people to take it, then that in my opinion is not fine, obviously. Now, if there is some degree of evidence that it's safe when consumed in the route that it's being consumed and in the dosage that it's being consumed, if it really just comes down to, I don't have enough evidence to say if this is effective or not, then it becomes a matter of perspective and a matter of preference. It becomes, how much evidence do you need in order to open up your wallet? My personal approach to supplementation is I need a lot of evidence before I do that. And my approach to content is I need a lot of evidence before I promote or recommend something like that. So it's a matter of perspective, but I will say this. I know there are a lot of people who are really excited about turkesterone and really enthusiastic about it, and they do want to get out ahead of the science and say, I've been using this for 2 years before science proved me right. That is a path that one can certainly explore. However, in the long run, if you just approach supplementation in that way generally, you will be wrong way more than you're right. If you look at the history of supplementation, the number of supplements that at one point had tremendous hype and then were pretty soundly disproven, and just unsupported by evidence. If you play the long game and you decide that you're going to get out ahead of every supplement before science says it actually works, you will be wrong way more frequently than you'll be correct. And so that's something to be aware of if you wish to adopt that particular approach.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think also is a lot of the testimonials and the things you hear online are, of course, anecdotes that are highly susceptible to placebo. And so someone might say, well, maybe that's okay. Like if they're getting the results, they're getting the results. But I would say, well, you're better off, playing the placebo game with something that also has placebo-controlled evidence supporting it, because then you'll get whatever it is that caused the placebo effect as a result of taking the new supplement. Plus, you'll actually get the independent effect of the supplement itself that's been, proven with research. So it's like even playing the placebo game is kind of silly with this one, I think.
The placebo game is interesting as well, because like you alluded to, there is an additive component, right? So you could take just a placebo effect or a placebo effect stacked on top of a real physiological effect. Now, if you're getting an effect, you're getting an effect, and that's good. Because I have heard of coaches who are like, is my programming just absolutely fantastic, or am I placeboing all my clients into making great gains? And I'm like, who cares? They were going to train, they're training, they're not getting hurt, it's effective, and they're making great gains. At that point, it doesn't really matter that much. Now, of course, you don't go out of your way to intentionally placebo people, because that's misleading and deceptive, and there's ethical issues with that. But no, the thing that's fascinating about placebos, though, is that the magnitude of the placebo effect can change based on our perceptions of the intervention, right? So like an injectable placebo can be stronger and have a bigger placebo effect than an oral capsule that is a placebo. And so what's really interesting is our expectation of the intervention will influence the magnitude of our placebo effect. And that's another reason that it can be really great to use something that has evidence supporting it, because you've already primed yourself. Even if some magnitude of benefit you're getting is a placebo effect, based on the evidence, you should be getting an effect. It is heightening that expectancy value that you're getting from it. You're expecting larger magnitude of effect because there's evidence. So even if you're using creatine and some percentage of that is a real effect and some percentage is a placebo effect, the fact that that there's like 600 studies showing creatine to work, that heightens the expectation and probably fuels a relatively larger placebo effect.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to check in with you, unless you have anything else, like any words of caution or anything you'd say regarding turkesterone or these types of supplements generally.
No, I think it's tough, because the way I make content, the way I discuss supplementation is usually very skeptical. It's always pretty evidence-based, pretty by the book. And so I think a lot of times people assume that it like keeps me awake at night to know that people are using a supplement that doesn't have applied evidence yet. And that's not the case. Like I have no interest as an evidence-based practitioner on people's parade. But I do generally encourage consumers to have some degree of expectation. I think it's good for a consumer to say, if you expect me to open my wallet, there are expectations that I need you to meet as a company. I need you to show me that your product is safe, and I need you to show me that it's effective. And that takes a level of commitment from the company. It takes time. It takes financial investment. It is a step that a company, that I expect a company to make before I will utilize its product in many cases. So when it comes to supplementation, I don't view it as trying to get a head start on science and trying to use theory and mechanisms to find the next big thing before everyone knows about it. My perspective as a consumer, because I'm a consumer just like everybody else, is I'd like a company to show me that they're committed to establishing that this product is worth my time and is worth my money. So that's my approach to consuming supplements, and that's my approach to recommending supplements. Um, but I'm very comfortable with the fact that other people have different perspectives. Some people, the thrill of the chase is what makes it fun with supplementation, which it's a way that you could do it. It's a route you could take. But the biggest thing is that, if you're a person who wants to get out ahead of the science and always be on the cutting edge, at the bare minimum, it's important to do your homework and at least make sure that the things you're consuming have a good track record of safety in humans. I mean, that's critically important.
Yeah, I think it's a slippery slope though when it comes to like the supplement companies and so on. It's like it can border on like exploitation of ignorance as well. It's almost like, at what point do you draw the line that it's like, okay, no, like, your goji berries are not going to cause 10 pounds of fat loss. No, your turkesterone hasn't been shown to cause 4 pounds of muscle gain. It's like, at what point does it become like, at what point does it enter scam territory? You know what I mean? Like, for sure, I get the like kind of like consumer has the choice to go according to like their own cost benefit analysis or whatever, assuming they are aware of the cards that are on the table. But in a lot of cases they aren't. And it's almost like, at what point should like, creators like us say, hold these companies like responsible or give them like a check, like, okay, no, like some of these claims are outrageous and like just straight up not evidence-based.
Yeah, I think we do have a responsibility to, when someone brings a product to our attention, say, is this an evidence-based claim? Does the evidence support this? Is there research showing these things to be true as they're stated? And of course, I always share my perspective on those questions specifically and say, oh, that's a marketing claim that is not based on human evidence and people lifting weights. And you're a human who is using this for weightlifting applications. So you should be very skeptical of that. And if you notice that a particular company is making several claims that are really aggressive extrapolations or just completely disconnected from evidence entirely, then that tells you a lot about that company. And so my thing is, I understand that people get a thrill out of trying to find the next big thing, and it's exciting and they enjoy that pursuit. One of the reasons I don't enjoy that pursuit and I don't recommend, supplements that lack established scientific evidence is for the very reasons that you're alluding to. I think my expectation is that if a company is selling an ingredient and they want me to embrace it as a consumer, they owe me. There are expectations. You owe me evidence, and companies are completely companies are in a position to provide that evidence to make it happen. They can fund the studies, they can put in the time and the effort and the financial resources to do that. And so, yeah, I don't encourage people to seek out the next up and coming supplement before the evidence arrives for that very reason. I think the company owes you more than that. And so, yeah, I'm never shy when someone says, hey, I'm excited about this supplement. I say, I think it's great that you're excited about your training and you're excited about your health. I think that's terrific. The claims that you asked me to verify, I cannot verify because they're not supported by evidence. And at that point, people can do what they wish with that information.
Awesome, man. I think that's all I've got for you. I really appreciate that. That was super helpful.